In the first years of Queen Elizabeth III's reign, the government of Spain wanted a very specific piece of intelligence out of England, and it had nothing to do with ships, armies, or trade routes. King Philip II wanted to know whether the new queen menstruated regularly, because that would determine whether she could produce an heir, and the answer to that question would shape the marriage politics of an entire continent. According to persistent reports from the period, a Spanish ambassador attempted to bribe Elizabeth's personal laundress, the one person who handled the Queen's sheets and linens every week, and therefore knew the state of the royal cycle better than most members of the royal council. Nobody at the time considered this an eccentric use of diplomatic resources. For most of European history, a queen's period was treated as official information, discussed by physicians, tracked by servants, mentioned in ambassadors' dispatches, and analyzed by foreign governments. So today we're going to take a look at what queens actually did during their periods, what they used, what their doctors believed was happening inside them, and why some of the most powerful institutions in the world kept records about it. To make sense of any of this, you first have to understand what people thought a period actually was. From ancient Greece until well into the 18th century, European medicine was built on humoral theory, the idea that health depended on the balance of fluids inside the body. Physicians in the tradition of Hippocrates and Galen taught that women's bodies were colder and moister than men's, which supposedly meant they could not use up their excess blood through internal heat the way men did. Menstruation in this system was the body's monthly method of expelling that surplus. In strictly medical terms, it was not shameful. It was considered necessary. A woman who bled regularly was thought to be healthy and fertile, while a woman whose bleeding stopped without pregnancy was thought to be in real danger because the retained blood could supposedly corrupt inside her and cause disease. So a queen's doctors did not want her cycle to disappear. They wanted it to arrive on time, every time, like correspondence. Nobody actually said the word menstruation out loud, though. English speakers called it a woman's courses, her terms, or her flowers. And the Habsburg imperial family in Austria developed their own private code. According to the historian Antonia Fraser, they referred to it as a visit from General Krottendorf, after a real Austrian contemporary, and shortened it to the General. Why the family named a monthly biological event after a specific military officer has never been explained. The officer's opinion on the matter was not recorded either. It's also worth knowing that queens and pre-modern women in general had considerably fewer periods than women do today. Around 1750, girls got their first period at approximately age 16, compared with an average of about 12 and a half now. After marriage, an elite woman was expected to be pregnant as often as possible, and each pregnancy, followed by recovery and months of nursing, meant long stretches without a cycle. Thomas Boleyn, the father of Anne Boleyn, wrote that in the early years of his marriage his wife brought me every year a child. A woman on that schedule might menstruate only a handful of times in an entire decade. This did not make the subject less important. It made every individual period more significant, because each one carried information. And here is a detail that surprises most people. For much of this era, a missed period by itself did not officially confirm a pregnancy. Medical certainty came only at quickening, the moment around the 4th month when the mother felt the child move, which meant that every time a queen's cycle paused, her household entered a months-long observation period in which physicians, ladies-in-waiting, and eventually entire governments waited to find out what it meant. So what did a queen actually use when the general arrived? Not underwear for a start. Between the medieval period and the early 1800s, most Western women did not wear underpants at all. The fashionable ladies of 16th century Italy were a rare exception. The garment worn next to the skin was a long linen shift, also called a chemise. For the bleeding itself, the standard solution for centuries was folded linen cloth. In 1600s, England these were called clouts, and they are the reason the expression "on the rag" exists. The cloths were washed, dried, and reused, month after month, sometimes for years. Some historians, including the researcher Sarah Redd, have documented evidence that many early modern women simply bled into their shifts and dealt with the laundry afterward. But recent archaeology has complicated that picture. In the Norwegian town of Tønsberg, the archaeologist Sunniva Vilberg Halvorsen re-examined textile fragments from a 13th-century latrine and found strips of cloth that had been deliberately torn, folded, and pleated into pad shapes. One of them tested positive for blood. Alongside the cloth, she found absorbent sphagnum moss, a bog plant so effective at soaking up liquid that it was later used in wound dressings. In other words, medieval women were manufacturing their own sanitary pads and then disposing of them down the toilet, a practice that, as any modern plumber can confirm, never really ended. Since there was no underwear to hold anything in place, the cloth was suspended from a belt or girdle tied around the waist. And this is where royalty enters the record with unusual precision, because we know what Queen Elizabeth I owned for this exact purpose. According to the historian Greg Jenner, the Queen possessed 3 black silk girdles to keep her linen sanitary cloths, listed in her wardrobe as vallops of Holland cloth, Holland being a particularly fine grade of linen. The most powerful woman in England used the same basic equipment as every farmwife in her kingdom. Hers was just nicer. Elizabeth is also famously said to have taken a bath once a month whether she needed it or not, and Jenner notes that the timing of that bath likely lined up with the end of her flow. Which brings us back to the espionage, because Elizabeth's cycle may be the most closely monitored in European history. She came to the throne in 1558 as an unmarried woman of 25, and the entire question of England's future depended on whether she would marry and produce an heir. That made her fertility a matter of international negotiation, and during the first 20 years of her reign, while half the princes of Europe considered her as a bride, her body was examined and discussed accordingly. She underwent an intimate examination by a physician specifically to establish that she could bear children. Foreign diplomats actively sought information about her menstrual cycle, and Philip II's agents went, as we have seen, directly to her laundress. Elizabeth's own government did essentially the same thing from the inside. In the mid-1560s, while weighing a proposed marriage, her chief advisor William Cecil quietly questioned the Queen's doctors, her laundress, and the ladies of the bedchamber about her health, her cycle, and her likelihood of conceiving, then recorded his findings in a formal memorandum. His conclusion was that she could have children. During later negotiations for a French match, one of her physicians went further and declared that if she married, "I will answer for her having 10 children." That is a doctor guaranteeing a specific number of babies to the European marriage market, which suggests the pressure was getting to everyone. Not everybody accepted the official assessments. The playwright Ben Jonson later claimed that Elizabeth had a membrana on her which made consummation impossible, while a widow named Dionysia Derrick spread the opposite story, claiming the Queen had already borne several secret children. Those 2 rumors cannot both be true, and there was no real evidence for either. But they circulated for decades anyway, which tells you how much of Europe's political conversation consisted of strangers speculating about one woman's reproductive system. If Elizabeth's cycle was watched because it kept arriving, her older sister Mary I was watched for the opposite reason, and her story is one of the saddest in royal medical history. Mary had suffered from irregular and painful periods since her youth, along with symptoms her doctors could never explain. In September 1554, 2 months after marrying Philip of Spain, the 38-year-old queen stopped menstruating. She gained weight, experienced morning sickness, and her belly grew, and her physicians confirmed a pregnancy. Nearly the entire court believed it. Parliament passed an act making Philip regent in the event that Mary died in childbirth. Following tradition, the public celebration waited until the Queen felt the child move, which happened at the end of November, when Mary wrote of the baby, "I declare it to be alive." In April 1555, she withdrew into confinement at Hampton Court. The nursery was prepared, wet nurses were hired, and her sister Elizabeth was released from house arrest and summoned to court to serve as a witness to the birth. Letters announcing the delivery were written in advance, with a blank space left for the date and extra room after the word "Prince," so that 2 letters could be added if the baby turned out to be a princess. On April 30th, A rumor escaped the palace that the queen had been delivered of a healthy son. Church bells rang across London, bonfires were lit, and congratulations began arriving from the continent before anyone could confirm that no birth had taken place. The due date was recalculated. May passed. Then June. The Venetian ambassador Giovanni Michieli privately predicted that the pregnancy would end in wind rather than anything else. He was right. By August, roughly 11 months after her cycle had stopped, Mary's abdomen had gone down and she left Hampton Court without a child. Modern historians generally consider this a case of pseudocyesis, a false pregnancy in which the body produces genuine physical symptoms. And then it happened again in 1557. This time Mary drew up her will while, in her own words, thinking myself to be with child. Almost everyone around her maintained the fiction. Only one attendant, a woman named Frideswyde Strelley, told her the truth, and Mary later thanked her for it, saying of her court, "None true to me but thou." Mary died in November 1558, possibly of a uterine or ovarian tumor, which would explain both the false pregnancies and the decades of menstrual problems that preceded them. Her reign, her marriage, and her final years were all shaped, publicly and painfully, by what her cycle did and did not do. 2 centuries later at Versailles, the surveillance system was still fully operational, except now the person running it was the Queen's own mother. When 14-year-old Marie Antoinette left Austria in 1770 to marry the future Louis XIV, Empress Maria Theresa demanded a constant supply of information about her daughter, and the monthly arrival of General Krottendorf was a fixed subject. Marie Antoinette dutifully reported her period to her mother every single month by letter from Versailles to Vienna. The Empress also maintained a second source, the Austrian ambassador Mercy Argenteau, who kept informants inside Marie Antoinette's own household and sent Maria Theresa secret reports on the details of her daughter's daily life, including her health. The reason for all this attention was that the marriage went unconsummated for 7 years, and until there was a pregnancy, every arrival of the general was, from Vienna's point of view, bad news delivered on schedule. Marie Antoinette's cycles were also irregular, which in an age without pregnancy tests meant repeated false hopes followed by disappointments, each one reported internationally. Court physicians of the era treated irregular courses with plants like chamomile, mugwort, and artemisia, which were believed to encourage the flow. She finally gave birth to her first child in December 1778, more than 8 years after her wedding. And it should be said that in this respect, royal women were only an extreme version of a general pattern. According to the historian Nahema Hanafi, noble women of the period routinely catalogued their periods in correspondence with their fathers or uncles because a woman's cycle was considered family health information that concerned the entire household. Privacy was simply not part of the arrangement at any level of society that could afford writing paper. And when the cycle failed to produce results, a queen was expected to fix the problem using the best medicine available, which was not good. Catherine de' Medici, who married the future Henry II of France in 1533, went roughly 10 years without conceiving, while the court openly discussed sending her back to Italy. Catherine responded with everything the 16th century had to offer. She surrounded herself with doctors, astrologers, magicians, alchemists, and seers. She drank large quantities of mule urine because mules are sterile, and the medical logic of the time held that this could function as a kind of inoculation against sterility. For the same reason, she refused to ever ride a mule. She drank the urine of pregnant animals, consumed the powdered sexual organs of boars and cats, and mixed assorted herbs into her food and wine. Whether any of this contributed is extremely doubtful, but after a decade she began having children and ultimately produced 10 of them, an outcome for which the astrologers presumably claimed full credit. All of this tracking and treating took place inside a culture that held genuinely alarming beliefs about menstrual blood itself. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, claimed that contact with it could turn new wine sour, make crops barren, dull the surface of mirrors, blunt steel blades, kill bees in their hives, and drive dogs mad. Those claims were repeated in various forms for well over 1,000 years. A hugely popular medieval treatise called De Secretis Mulierum, attributed to the scholar Albertus Magnus, went further and asserted that during menstruation women became instruments of the devil who corrupted everything within their reach. That book survives in more than 80 manuscript copies, which gives you some idea of its circulation. The official position of the Church was, at least at the very top, more moderate. In the year 601, Pope Gregory the Great ruled that menstruating women should not be barred from church or from communion, writing that the monthly courses of women are no fault, because nature causes them. But local authorities kept overruling him. In the late 7th century, Theodore of Canterbury forbade menstruating women from receiving the Eucharist entirely, and versions of that restriction persisted across medieval Europe. Church teaching also framed period pain as part of Eve's punishment for original sin, which meant that relieving it was not merely difficult, it was theologically inappropriate, since the suffering was understood to be part of the divine plan. Meanwhile, devout women who fasted so severely that their periods stopped were often interpreted as receiving a sign of divine favor rather than a symptom of malnutrition. Couples were instructed to avoid intercourse during menstruation, with warnings that children conceived at that time would be born red-haired and puny, a belief that must have made life mildly unpleasant for red-haired children. A queen absorbed every bit of this. She could govern a country while a significant portion of learned opinion held that, for several days, a month, her glance was hazardous. As for what a queen could actually take when her period was painful, heavy, or absent, the list of available treatments was short and occasionally amphibian. From the 15th century onward, physicians dealing with menstrual problems recommended enemas, physical exercise, and emmenagogue plants, meaning herbs believed to bring on a delayed flow. Bloodletting was standard as well, sometimes from a vein in the foot, on the theory that opening a vein down there would draw the blood in the correct direction. For excessive bleeding, one recorded remedy involved powdered toad, and some women went a step further and wore dried toads tied at the waist in the hope of slowing the flow. There is no mechanism by which a dead toad influences the uterus, but as historical treatments go, at least this one was external. For period pain, 17th century doctors had one confident prescription for unmarried women, which was to get married, and one for married women, which was to have more sex in order to balance the humors. Whatever else can be said about historical medicine, it reliably produced solutions that were convenient for someone other than the patient. Through all of this, a queen's public schedule did not pause. Western European courts had no custom of royal withdrawal during menstruation. Queens attended chapel, held audiences, danced, hunted, and rode on the usual calendar, managing linen and girdles underneath layers of formal dress, with ladies-in-waiting handling the supply and laundresses handling the results. And those results were treated, quite literally, as evidence. Elite women watched one another's bodies for signs of conception, and in 18th century England, even the frequency with which a woman's shifts went to the laundry could be scrutinized as an indicator of a change in her menstrual regularity, meaning a possible pregnancy. For a queen, the sequence was predictable. The laundress knew first, the physicians knew second, and the council and the foreign ambassadors knew shortly after that. A missed period triggered medical observation. A confirmed pregnancy, announced at quickening, triggered national celebration, and a cycle that returned when a pregnancy was hoped for triggered official correspondence, in multiple languages, expressing official disappointment. The strange final development is that things eventually became quieter, but not immediately better. In the 19th century, according to Hanafi, the rise of middle-class ideas of modesty pushed menstruation out of acceptable conversation entirely, so a subject that ambassadors had once discussed in formal dispatches became unmentionable in polite company. Queen Victoria went through 9 pregnancies and her entire reproductive life before commercial menstrual products existed at all. The first disposable pads, Lister's towels, appeared in 1888 and sold poorly, partly because women were too embarrassed to ask for them. Sanitary belts, which held washable or disposable pads in place, remained in use from the 1890s all the way into the 1970s. During the First World War, nurses discovered that cellulose surgical bandages absorbed better than cloth, which led directly to Kotex in 1921, and commercial tampons followed in the 1930s. There was even a brief attempt to sell pads made of sphagnum moss, the same bog plant found in that medieval latrine in Norway, roughly 700 years after medieval women had already thought of it. All of which means that every queen you have ever read about before the 20th century, from Eleanor of Aquitaine to Elizabeth to Marie Antoinette to Victoria, handled her period with folded linen, a belt, and the discretion of her laundress. And that discretion was the one thing her money could never fully buy. A queen had physicians, ladies-in-waiting, and the finest Holland cloth in Europe. But she had less menstrual privacy than the poorest woman in her kingdom, because nobody was bribing a farmhand's laundress, and no ambassador ever wrote a dispatch about a milkmaid's cycle. For a royal woman, the most private function of her body was treated as public information, logged by servants, interpreted by doctors, and read out, in translation, in foreign courts. Queens managed their periods the way everyone else did, with linen, a belt, and patience. The difference is that when they did it, governments filed reports.